welcome to the stage Kevin Wood, the moderator of this session. Thank you. The floor is yours,
Well,
Kevin.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much. So I'd like to welcome you to today's session here at IoT World ICS Security Day. What we're going to be talking about today is secure remote access to those critical IoT assets. But before we get started there, I want to call your attention to the tool here, make sure that everybody is familiar of where things are located. Over to the right of your screen, you'll see chat, Q&A, polls. Just to get familiar with, why don't everybody just go ahead and post where you're joining us from. That'll let everybody get familiar with the tool and get everybody started. So we will be taking questions throughout this, but we would prefer if we could get those questions posted in Q&A. We will take those questions and then we'll try to answer as many live at the end as we can as well. So once again, this is a, let's call it a 59-minute session. We're going to do our very best to get you out of here right on time, but I hope you find a lot of value today in what we're actually going to talk about. So today, before we get started, my name is Kevin Wood. I am an architectural lead at Cisco in the IoT sales team. But I want to introduce my panel that'll be joining us today. So we're going to go a round robin here before we get started and introduce those folks. So let's start out with Ruben.
Yep. Hey, Kevin. Thank you. Glad to be here. My name is Ruben Lobo. I lead product management for our industrial switching and industrial cybersecurity product portfolio at Cisco.
Thanks, Ruben. Pete.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Pete Kavanagh, also in the Industrial IoT Business Unit, and I'm an internal solution architect.
All right, and last but not least, Tim.
Hello, everybody. Tim Householder. I'm an industry advisor with Worldwide Technology in the manufacturing and distribution practice.
Well, welcome, folks. I look forward to an interactive and lively discussion here on this topic. It's a critical topic. And so I'm going to introduce it real quick here. And as we think about the need to access these remote OT assets, there's some use cases or some key needs that come to mind. And the first one, if we look at maintenance. So how do we get access in remote configuration from vendors and third parties into those systems? And the next one is active troubleshooting. So when something does go wrong, how do we pull those remote experts in quickly to help solve those issues, maintain productivity at all times? And then the third and final is, how do we avoid those unnecessary truck rolls? Can we get somebody into a site, whether it be a large site or whether it be an extreme remote site, to actually repair and help that to reduce the OpEx spend? So those are all critical needs, but then how do we do that? So I think it's probably a great time to kind of kick us off here to ask our first poll question. Now, this will be a multiple choice poll question. And the question here is what methods are you using today to connect to remote OT assets? So the options there: VPN, cellular gateway, VDI, RDP, SSH, and remote access software. Take a look at that poll question. Love to hear and get some feedback from you on where you are today. So while we're getting the answers for that, we'll take a look at it here as shortly. Let's talk a little bit about, Tim, I'm going to come to you first and talk a little bit about, a lot of our industrial control customers out there, and those teams. How do they get access today? What techniques do they use to access that environment typically today?
Sure, Kevin. So, many of the options that you put up in the poll there are options that are used today. And I think to dig into those options a little bit more, a lot of times when those options are being used, they're also being used in conjunction with insecure devices that have access into those trusted networks or into those controls networks. So even if they need coming in on encrypted connections from the outside in, they're then logging into unsecured or trusted devices, but not overly monitored or secured devices in the environment, such as an employee's laptop, right? So hosting a third party or remote expert into a laptop that they then give access, either directly plugging in or through the use of remote software into the controls network. That may be used through a number of different applications, but sometimes that requires the individual team member to sit there and monitor it, sit there, eyes on screen, giving permissions, or at least watching to make sure no bad actor or bad motions are made or pushed. And really that puts a lot of strain in terms of the time when that person should be doing something else or focused on other things. The other thing is that a lot of times these remote access ingress type of connections are not taken down, right? So once they're open, they're open. So unless you go through a lot of times ongoing audits and cleanup of those connections, or audits of existing connections that may be valid, but perhaps we need to do a higher level encryption or things like that to meet compliance standards, that's not always done. So all those options that were put in there, from the direct VPN into a VDI environment, or even, one of my least favorite ones, the direct VPN module into a trusted network or a controls network environment. Those are all options being used today, and ones that people are trying to keep that functionality and that convenience in, but make sure that they're not accepting any risk into those environments.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. It sounds like opportunities to connect and a lot of potential risks that we have to maintain and monitor. So that's fantastic. So talked about a little bit about our industrial use cases with manufacturing. So let's take a little bit of a shift about another use case. And Pete, and we'll transfer over to you. And so we think about those needs and use cases around what I'll call extreme remote situations for connectivity, and specifically to things like roadways. So what are those needs and use cases that you typically see in those environments?
Yeah, I think, from a roadways perspective, obviously you have roadways assets in a downtown environment, and that's maybe more easy to get to, but a lot of roadways assets are extremely sparsely distributed. They're a long way out from their kind of control center, their management center. And they kind of fall into two categories, some of which are permanently connected, but when you need kind of ad hoc remote sessions to kind of get into them to maybe do some vendor troubleshooting or vendor firmware maintenance, typically there's a lot of kind of managed services that come along with these roadways assets. They're high value assets. And also, in the even more remote use cases, these are things that, are kind of autonomous, and you only connect into them from a remote perspective as and when is kind of needed. And the ability to do that securely, but also keep it simple is just like Tim was articulating on the manufacturing side, is kind of, I think, equally challenging for us. And there's more and more of these things kind of cropping up because customers are starting to actually connect more previously unconnected assets. So we're now having assets coming onto our networks that were previously disconnected. It's great because we can have our customers unlock new use cases with them. Part of the challenge is that the more things they connect without a good approach to doing that, the more exposure they're kind of creating. And especially if you think about the fact that a lot of countries, a lot of governments view transportation as critical infrastructure now. It's very much aligned with things like energy, utilities, solar sites, batteries, all these things as well, which themselves come with this kind of very remote perspective, but needing that kind of secure connectivity, again, for staff troubleshooting, for vendor troubleshooting, for vendor maintenance. Okay, great. So before we, and I'm going to stay on Pete here for a second, but before we go to this next question for Pete, I'd like to launch our second our poll question. So what are those top concerns with remote OT access? So when we think about those, think about, is it unauthorized access? Is it scheduling? Is it broad host access? Or is it around infections and ransomwares or due to breaches? So go ahead and answer that poll question. Love to get your thoughts there on what your top concerns are and where your care abouts are in that area. Now, to dovetail to that question, Pete, I'm going to, like I say, stay with you here. So think about the use cases that Tim talked about and what you talked about in transportation. What are those? Talk about those risks that we've seen and you've collectively experienced with these access methods that we described in these industrial environments. Yeah, just sticking for roadways for a second, Kevin. The one thing I've seen, unfortunately, far too often is the customer or maybe the service provider partner on behalf of the customer taking a kind of a simplistic approach to make it easy for the customer to consume and easy for them to kind of come in and provide remote access and remote management for those assets. But they've done it in a way that kind of from every other respect is really not a best practice. And the one thing that, really jumps out at me there is they'll buy, a generic cellular modem, they'll spend money on actually a premium SIM card that gives them a public IP address on that WAN interface. And then they'll do port forwarding directly in from the dirty public internet, right, through to their the critical infrastructure asset. And by doing that, you're kind of already putting all of the pressure onto the shoulders of the connected devices behind, which are, as I think most of us here would recognize, they're traditionally not architected and designed to be internet facing. They don't have like inherent kind of firewall secure capabilities. And you're often straight into like, a non-HTTPS, basically a regular HTTP, like an admin web interface, right? And it's super convenient because all I need to do is tell someone the IP address and they know the credentials and they can get in. So the convenience is really high, but on every other kind of metric, it's really not a kind of a great thing. And along those same lines, I think, especially when we're dealing with third parties and having vendors and other kind of other entities come in and help us in our customer network, we're, to Tim's point, we're in way less control over like what machine they're connecting in from, what network they're connecting in from, right? We're kind of exposing ourselves up to a lot of unknowns on that side of the kind of conversation. And again, these are mission critical kind of critical infrastructure environments. So it's the kind of thing that we can't really afford not to take into consideration. Again, like part of the challenges is, with a lot of these remote access solutions and situations, once you're coming into a network segment, you're notionally coming into a single device, and that's why you're doing a remote access session. Once you're kind of on that device, but by and large, you've then got a lot of freedom to then move laterally from that kind of east-west to other devices, which frankly you were never supposed to have access to. And it's very difficult to, in the traditional sense, kind of have control over that or even visibility that any of that kind of stuff is going on. So again, it's like that challenge of I'm exposing a session for a legitimate purpose. It's to solve a business problem. It's to bring in, in theory, a trusted partner. Is that trusted partner coming in with a trusted device? Probably not from my organization's posture perspective. And also then have I kind of given them a way in that then I can't see where they're going from there? And not that they themselves might do that deliberately, but who knows what malware and infectious kind of, agents kind of might be kind of making that lateral move, without their knowing it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I know, having grown up in the manufacturing space, having seen this time and time again where we stand up those third-party connections via VPN and other things, and what do we forget to do? We forget to close them. So, and they're kind of like that propagation of the infinite firewall rule, right? The rules stay there, the VPNs stay there until somebody does cleanup, and by that time, you really don't know what those rules are for. So everybody's afraid to delete them. So yeah, that's a true problem and risk there. So really what we're talking about here, and I hear in both of you say, is these SRA issues are probably across all the verticals that we have at play. I know we've talked about manufacturing, industrial controls, we talked about transportation, but I would hazard to say that across all of our verticals that have any OT space whatsoever, this is a problem. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so.
Yep, perfect. So now, all right, so we've kind of made the case here, the historical ways that we've done this and some of the inherent risks with it, and I think everybody kind of sees that. So what do we do now? So if we step back and think about the new direction of how we get access to these remote accesses. Now, I'll keep this on you, Pete, and before we go back to Tim, but can we discuss this new direction and we think about, the hot new topic, ZTNA? So Zero Trust Network Access. Can you talk a little bit about that and how we could leverage that to access OT assets?
Yeah, I think it's important to understand really, like, if we're talking about this new concept, again, let's compare it to kind of how things are done today in a lot of situations, right? And so a lot of these solutions, we described a couple of them, with maybe kind of port forwarding and things, but VPNs is a common method of doing that today, and in a more structured way. And like, Tim highlighted correctly the point that often, these things are set up and then never torn down again. And ideally, it should be kind of a session based as opposed to a permanent connection. But these VPN kind of based technologies is a good way of doing it. I think the challenge is, like we discussed, they're always on, and like it's like a binary function, right? You've either got access or you haven't, and then once you've got access, you've kind of got complete access. There's not the granularity there kind of we would like. Also, from a firewall perspective, it's great that firewalls are in the mix here, but then you're kind of struggling with the fact that you're granting a certain amount of the access via the firewall rule, on the firewall set of rules, and then kind of trying to map that back into kind of mapping to users and applications and hosts they're allowed to connect to, and that kind of like a triangular relationship of like who can access what devices with kind of which access methods. It becomes really difficult to manage at scale for our customers, and therefore they kind of don't, right? That's kind of really what we've seen, right? Like in theory, there's lots of extra stuff you can do. You can tie in your firewall into maybe identity management, you know, a lot of more things, and kind of create more granularity. But like as with many things in life and many things in the IIoT space, if it's too complicated, it just doesn't get done. Right. And so that's kind of where we're coming at from a lot of our customers' traditional remote access using VPN as a methodology. I think if we're kind of then switching to see, well, what's ZTNA, right? How is that concept different than kind of, you know, maybe traditional way of doing it? I think one of the big shifts there, Kevin, is really we're not completely beholden to this kind of VPN gateway and having to come in a certain direction from the untrusted network, traditionally from the internet through that. We're now really shifting the responsibility up to the ZTNA trust broker, which could be on-prem or in the cloud. But by having it in the cloud, it kind of even further, I think, expands your reach. And then really that kind of like that whole posture of which people can access which host by which access methods, and how I can kind of curate that in one place versus it being a combination of like firewall rules and, you know, another policy kind of held elsewhere, becomes a lot simpler to manage and give you that kind of single place to really kind of see and define what's going on. So it's kind of like that trust broker is then managing the kind of the identity, and also can do that on a time-based kind of principle. So again, it's not like always on. We can actually very temporarily in a time-bound window define in the ZTNA world, you know, who can access it for which time period. And then back to the firewall, again, absolutely firewalls are critical in all of this. But the way a ZTNA solution can work is we can actually kind of piggyback off of an outbound firewall session. So we're not having to expose our firewall to as many kind of incoming connections. And again, that can overall really help to, you know, increase our resiliency on the firewall side by reducing those exposures.
Okay, so when we look at it, I'll just for everybody on the call here. So nobody's done anything wrong here, right? This is the way that, you know, we've kind of operated this way out of necessity. So really what we're really looking for now is a better way to achieve this. And, you know, ZTNA is a step in the right direction, although we'll talk about it in a few minutes. And you mentioned it too a minute ago, Pete, is getting closer to that access layer is ever important to reduce your scope of compromise. So we'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute. But thanks for that, Pete. I do want to jump to Tim here for just a second. And when we go back and start thinking about what this ZTNA change is going to do, and the concept of how does it change the remote access concept of who, what, when, and where, and how access is actually gained into the control environment?
Yeah, sure. And before I go into that, though, I just want to reiterate what Kevin said: is nobody's done anything wrong here. You know, and he said he was guilty of the firewall stuff. I am absolutely guilty of that. I'm guilty of setting up the B2B VPNs. I'm guilty of not removing my firewall. Look, I've done all that stuff, right? So I'm just as guilty as anybody else out here, and I've shared that experience. But that's why I think it's so important to really come back and not continue to proliferate that bad actor or that bad admin behavior, and really start to focus this in, right? And to Pete's point, by providing a centralized platform, right? It's not just about it's in the cloud or it's on premises, or even that it becomes easier to use, right? It hits on some of these functionality things that become really important to an overall security strategy, right? So landing on a centralized platform brings consistency into the environment. So both your third parties across all your multitude of locations, as well as your own associates and team members, will have a consistent experience, right? It'll fit easily into a more centralized and accepted standardized process that can standardize against a policy, right? From a security policy, right? It becomes more easy to audit it, to give reports out to executives and internal and external auditors within a security solution, to be able to easily just move on about your day and not get stuck into weeks and months worth of auditing against all your multitude of sites. Because that's one of the things that becomes really challenging, is we talk about it as though even in the existing state of how we accomplish this remote access into our environments, right, that it's all the same across all our facilities. And we all know that's probably not true either. Everybody does their own thing based off of what they need to get done, and what their resources are at their disposal at any moment in time. So really, these types of solutions and landing on these platforms brings that like common platform into the mix, which then also brings adaptability, right? So by doing that, I can bring in different types of forms of connectivity from a clientless and a client-based option, right? So I can do it over a secured web-based type of portal, or if I need a heavier client for the type of workload that I'm doing, then I can do that as well. But the point is it doesn't lock you into one or the other. It can adapt to the different use cases that you may have based off of the type of work that needs to be done, right? And really that comes down to maintaining that that ease of access that everybody's kind of used to. Like, whenever I need it, it's there and I can get on and I can do it. And there's not a lot of friction there, but bringing it into being more secure and removing some of that friction, where before a lot of the security mechanisms and platforms have been there to prevent the access before and stopping the work. We want to remove that friction and enable the work, but still get us to a more secure position.
Yeah, and I think about risk, and we talked about it. Right now, the industrial space is, I hate to say it, but it's a hacker's playground in a lot of ways. And every day that I interact with clients, there is, this is outside their control. There is aged systems out there that run in production that can't be patched, that are vulnerable. And we have to put compensating controls around them. And without controlling this ingress access and reducing the scope, I mean, that just further exacerbates our problem, right? So we definitely want to think about how to narrow this down, and that's where we're going to get to here today. So staying with you, Tim, talking about when we think about outside of all your apparent outcomes for providing remote access to external, internal teams, what have you, what are the other benefits that we gain by adopting this type of updated approach that's different from the legacy?
Yeah, so this really gets down to it, because look, I think we all agree that we want to do things securely, and we listen to a lot of this, and everybody's in agreement. And then security is a lot like insurance. You should buy it, you should invest in it, and you're like, man, I'm not using it. Why am I spending money on this? And that's really what security comes in a lot of these flavors. And what I would say is, in order to justify this to the business, it's looking at how you do the things today and what the cost, not just from hard dollars, right? But from, like Kevin mentioned, risk. What's the cost of risk should the worst scenario happen, right? Really be able to quantify that, right? And be able to say, in our existing processes today and how we address this, what are the overhead costs? I spoke previously about the team member that's sitting there watching somebody on their laptop while they do some certain function. How much per hour do we pay that engineer to sit there and watch a laptop when they could be doing many other tasks within the facility that need to be done, right? So there's a cost to that. So there is a reduction of cost when you talk about some of these solutions, when you really sit and think about, how am I addressing this today, right? And there's cost of risk too when you start to move through doing this on some equipment that, to Kevin's point, is outdated, right? Isn't under support anymore. There's a risk to that as well. So bringing that on to compliance is good. But then you get into some solutions, again, when we go to the IT folks or the enterprise solutions folks, we say, hey, I need to do a remote access. A lot of times they default back into their solutions that they provide for normal admin work or enterprise work, back office work, right? VDI. Let's do VDI, right? And that's great, but there's a cost associated with expanding that VDI environment and whether or not that VDI environment reaches into the right areas and even the right locations that you need it to. So if I'm going to expand that infrastructure, there's a cost to compute, virtualization, ongoing application licenses. And then you get into, do I need to pull the applications that I need to use into that VDI environment? So then you could be breaking different levels of security that maybe you've worked a long time to even establish, right? Aligning to Purdue model or IEC 62443. And you're like, okay, great. Well, now I just blew all my conduits away because I had to make this direct line to do this. So it's things like that that is a cost in terms of licensing, infrastructure, and then operational complexity, right? When I've got to maintain all these different environments, when I have to maintain even a bigger, newer environment, do I have the operational overhead and skill set to be able to implement it without being impactful to my production, right? That's one of the biggest things that we want to make sure of is reduction in complexity and overhead and not interrupting production and control networks, right? So really, those are some of the additional outside of just the remote access that you come into. And even I'll just share one more story of how somebody approached it is, there's some clients that even issue their own corporate laptops. They have security on their mind. And they're like, look, we're not going to let you use your own laptop to come into our network. So you use our laptop, right? And we know we can posture assess that and we can apply our policies to it, right? But there's a cost in that too. You have to go into the lease on the equipment. You have to maintain it from a licensing perspective. There's the overhead of the support for that third-party contractor. So all those types of things come into play when you think about how you're doing it today and how you can ease the cost and the process when you look at moving ZTNA for remote access into the OT environment.
Well, the more you cast those laptops out there, even for the partner, whatever, the greater their risk and exposure level is too, right?
Right.
I was talking to a client the other day who didn't have a remote access strategy. And I'm going to classify them as one of those extreme use cases where I have to get in a truck and drive 4 hours to get to this remote location. And OpEx was just literally killing them. So definitely some huge outcomes and opportunities to reduce a lot of that stress on the organization for sure. All right, so I'm going to switch gears and focus on Ruben here for a second. So what I'm hearing here is ZTNA helps this challenge a lot, but it is not the end-all be-all strategy as natively ZTNA is put together. So there's the factors of where does that trust broker should live, and then where do I put the gateway to gain the most secure direct access? So I'm going to transition to Ruben here for a second. And Ruben, talk to us a little bit about how we are changing that paradigm with the new solution and how we can help alleviate some of that stress.
Yeah, absolutely. So before I kind of like jump into the solution, I kind of want to summarize, some of the points that I heard from Tim and Pete here, and maybe bring in some other aspects that we hear from our customers, right? So there are three key consistent themes that we always hear at Cisco when we talk to our customers in industrial space, maybe manufacturing, utilities, oil and gas, roadways, across the base. There are three things that stand out, and maybe Tim and Pete, I'll come back to you and just maybe get a couple of points from you on there as well. So the first thing that we hear, and this is most commonly happens in like plant networks like manufacturing, where you have this shadow IT problem, right? You've got machine builders, you've got system integrators who are, who want to offer value-added services to their customers. And to offer those value-added services like predictive maintenance, they need access to those machines that they're sold to these manufacturers, right? And so very often there's cellular gateways that get brought into this environment, and they essentially end up being like remote access backdoors into this customer's environment, right? And so maybe Tim, I know you briefly touched upon it, and maybe you can kind of elaborate. What are some of the challenges as an end customer? You consult with a lot of them. What do the end customers have to do? How do they deal with this? Like, how many of them are even aware that they've got all of these backdoors, right? And you've got these tiny little gateways, hidden in these machines. Maybe just elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, sure. So the real quick answer to that is a lot of times they don't, right? They find out by mistake. It's much like with rogue wireless, right? Until you put in until there's a project to say, hey, I want to really understand my spectrum because we're going to go upgrade to the latest, greatest Wi-Fi, or we're looking at private cellular or XYZ. And you really sit down and you really have to take a hard look at your environment. Look, day to day, when you put on the PPE and you go into those production environments and stuff, there's one thing on your mind, and that's churning out the product, right? And that's it, and fixing any fires that come your way. They're not thinking about, oh wow, I don't know what that blinky thing over there does if it gives access, if it's not a red blinky thing and everything's still operating, right? So it's one of those things that they don't even know. And a lot of times it's even that I had one situation where I was doing a walk with a client, and we were talking about data acquisition, and really what they talked about, we were talking about, okay, well, where does it go, right? Data lakes, blah, blah, blah. And they said, actually, we just found out the other day that we have a historian in the cloud. The machine builder automatically went out, and we're doing a cloud-based historian, and we didn't even know it was communicating, right? So there's equipment and there's software and connections that are happening when equipment comes into the facilities that are just, not even disclosed a lot of times, right? And so that's where you get into some of those things. I think some of the new laws and processes from like the governmental perspective, right? So you talk about SBOMs and things like that, right? Understanding what is in these systems that you are purchasing and putting in your facilities are really, really important. But that doesn't help us now. So a lot of times when people find these things, when they put in tools, Ruben, for visibility that can communicate with those types of equipment that they haven't had before, right? So it really is a process one way or the other. Either you stumble by it by accident because you heard somebody talk about it, or somebody opens up a ticket against it, or you find it when you're doing some of these other more modernization projects or putting in some modernized tools to be able to impact other areas of the business.
Yeah, exactly, Tim. And we have other security risk assessment tools within the portfolio, and that's one of the most common asks that we get is, hey, can you sniff out these gateways that we don't know exist? Can you find them using your deep packet inspection tools, right? And so getting to the second common theme that we always hear, and maybe Pete, I'll ask you what you see in your neck of the woods here, which is there's always this cost of dedicated hardware, and having to maintain it, install it in places, especially in roadways and remote areas where you may not have space. The challenges that you have there, and the other big issue with respect to the supply chain situation, right? Meaning the solution in place is provided by a vendor, which is most likely a software-based solution, but then you got to install this stuff on some hardware, and you don't know where this hardware is coming from, and you don't know what the supply chain integrity of that particular of the hardware is. And maybe Pete, you can comment on what do you see in maybe roadways as an example.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of roadways and those other remote asset scenarios across different verticals, I think space is a challenge, right? We see that those customers are space constrained. They don't have huge data centers out there. They can just put another 1RU device in there, right? They're space constrained, and what's very attractive to them is something that's small and industrial rated that can fit into those environments. So that's kind of space as a premium. There's a lot of environmental requirements that they have to comply to install these things in the field. So again, that's kind of limiting the number of boxes out there that could fulfill that. And yeah, to your point, it's got to be simple. If I'm having to install software, how do I manage that? And again, like as we're seeing transportation and certainly in the utility space, critical infrastructure, right? How's that whole supply chain kind of root of trust, manufacturing right from the factory all the way to being installed in the road cabinet, whatever it is? And how can I be confident in that? Am I actually creating a bigger exposure for my network by installing this box in the field?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so maybe let's transition kind of to the solution. So Pete, Kevin, if you can advance the slide there. This kind of brings me to like the third point, right? We already spoke about, and you hinted at this, Kevin, in the beginning, which is you've got this notion of control now shifting to a centralized trust broker. And a trust broker could be on-prem, it could be in the cloud, but then there's the big question of where does this gateway sit, right? And that's where the first kind of like challenge comes in, which is, in a lot of these networks, the OT assets are, way below from where the IDMZ sits, right? And so the challenge is, the question is, where does this centralized gateway sit? And most customers end up putting this gateway in a centralized location, mainly to avoid these challenges that we spoke about in terms of like having to distribute these gateways out closer to the assets, be it in manufacturing, under one roof, or in, say, transportation or some other vertical, distributed across large sites, right? So there's a cost involved there. And so to make up for that cost, generally the gateway gets centralized. What that then ends up happening because of that is that now the burden is on the end customer to figure out how to expose the reachability to these OT assets up to that centralized gateway, right? And in all of these environments, as we know, there's a lot of NAT that goes on, mainly because every machine that gets put in or every particular process or system that gets put in is very cookie cutter, right? It's repeatable. And so there's a lot of private IP addresses in use, and very few of the assets in these environments actually get exposed or natted up to the higher layers, right? Like just talking about manufacturing as an example, you might tend to NAT the PLC and maybe the HMI, but nobody's natting the drives and the IO and the ton of other assets that you have, right? But even this burden of exposing these IP addresses now is on the end customer, right? And if you want to truly get into predictive maintenance, if you want to figure out when that drive is going to fail, and think about all the initiatives going on in these environments, you have to have full connectivity to these assets. You have to be able to extract data from the sensors and the drives, and not just the PLCs and the HMIs and so on. And so now, if you start exposing those IP addresses, now you're kind of like flattening the network, and you're kind of going against the whole resource isolation that you had in place, right? So that complexity is now on the end user to make all of that happen. And then the last point is that one of the key things, and I think this was Pete, you touched upon this, lateral movement, right? You've got this dual challenge, which is you have your perimeter security. Most customers have it, and it's in place. And bringing zero trust concepts into the environment, you're trying to shrink your zones of trust. You're trying to create zones and segments, below the firewall. And to do that, you need another solution. You need to bring in another solution in place. And so not all of these, from a security standpoint, you're trying to achieve a common objective, but you have to bring in multiple solutions in place to kind of stitch all of these things together, right? And when the gateway is far away from the assets, and you're exposing more of the assets up to the higher levels of the Purdue model, things become more and more challenging. And so this is kind of what we've been hearing from our customers. And so as you can see here in this slide, it's just not about, you've got a certain segment of customer base who's moving away from, the traditional remote access solutions to adopting, enterprise technologies like ZTNA in this space, but it's not easy. There's still challenges to overcome. And we looked at this, and we decided to address it in a particular way, mainly along how we position the ZTNA gateway. So if we move on to the next slide here, at Cisco, we've been on this journey for a while now, and this particular chart over here is talking about the problem from the context of a ZTNA solution, where we're trying to consolidate, multiple point products. In this particular case, on the left-hand side, you can see you have a remote, you have a dedicated gateway, you have an industrial switch, Maybe you have another gateway that's extracting data from your machines. Maybe you have a different gateway that is, acting as a sensor to assess the risk in your environment and that's doing deep packet inspection. You've got all of these point products that different departments are putting in place, and they're all competing against each other. And at Cisco, we've been on this journey to kind of take all this, the functionality of all of this point hardware and implement it as software features on the industrial network, right? And so what we're doing here for the ZTNA solution is that we have taken the functionality of the ZTNA gateway and embedded it into our industrial networking portfolio. So the agent, the ZTNA gateway, is now available within the Cisco industrial switches and the Cisco industrial routers, right? And that solves many, many problems because you no longer have to deal with dedicated hardware. Our trust workflow for ZTNA is in the cloud. It's part of our IoT operations dashboard platform, and you have a centralized location for policy and control, right? And with that, you get a whole bunch of functionality that's available. With Zero Trust, the first and foremost thing is you want least privilege access. You want to start there. You want to start by giving least privilege access, and we've got all of those controls in place. The solution has multi-factor authentication and single sign-on, right? So as you move from one platform to another platform, you are integrated into your IDP and you don't have to keep signing on, and you're doing multi-factor authentication to make sure the user who's logging in is the person who he or she says they are. The second part is different users have different needs for what they want to access within these environments. For some users, a simple clientless solution through a web browser is perfectly, acceptable, gets them SSH access, gets them RDP, and kind of meets all of their needs. And you can do all of that clientless on your web browser. Other users require more complex tools. Every OT engineer has a whole ecosystem that they subscribe into to manage their automation and control. And so you have your OEM vendor providing you various software, right? And so you need to be able to run that dedicated software from your desktop or workstation to reach these remote assets. And so we have an agent-based solution that allows you to do that. We spoke about the risk of what these remote users, or even in certain cases, to the point that you made, Tim, the local users might bring into the environment, by mistake in terms of like what's running on their machines. And so there's a remote user host posture check that's there to ensure that the posture of the machine that the user is using to get in complies to the posture requirements of the end customer, right? And so you no longer have to deal with these dedicated laptops that you're giving out to these users. All of that can be enforced through the posture check that we do through our integration with Duo. Every remote user has different needs, and as the admin, you want to give them access to certain things, and then give them the ability to do some things in certain cases and others in different cases. And so we have role-based authorization that dictates exactly what the user can do on that particular asset. There is resource-based isolation, meaning the system is set up in such a way that when you log in, you have access only to specific assets, and you can only do specific things on those assets. We spoke about audit and compliance. You want to be able to record what these remote users are doing so that you can go back and check to see what was happening. So there's session recording in place. There's scheduling, right? Now you've got these environments are 24/7, and you got to be able to schedule users in different time zones to come in at different time. And so there's scheduling in place, and so the user can come in only at a specific point in time and only stay for a specific period of time before they get off. And then most importantly, Tim, you brought up this point about a user literally standing next to the person watching what they're doing so that they're not doing something wrong, right? And the ability for admins to sit anywhere in the world and watch what a remote user who's sitting in a different part of the world is doing, and watch the entire screen and figure out if, you know, they want to kick that user out or kill that session if they're doing something wrong. All of that is baked into the solution. And so what we've done here is use the trust broker in the cloud to centralize policy control, eliminated the need for a dedicated gateway for the ZTNA agent, and just embedded that into the network. And because that agent is sitting close to the resource, you no longer have to maintain dedicated hardware, and you've got, you know, access to the assets that are closest to the networking entity that is connecting them. So with that, let me move to the last slide here, and we can wrap it up and take questions. I just want to use this to kind of summarize the benefits of having this gateway, ZTNA gateway, embedded in the network, right? You no longer have to depend on dedicated hardware that is sitting centrally, that then, you know, puts the burden on the end users to figure out how to get those assets connected to the gateway, or have the headache of maintaining these gateways, you know, down closer to the assets, right? That part comes directly embedded in the network itself. And so now we have remote access to the assets using the same switch or route, industrial switch or industrial router that you're using to connect this environment, right? That's the first kind of like major benefit. The next one is the complexity of you know, maintaining firewall rules. We both touched upon this, and that's kind of an inherent benefit of a ZTNA solution, because the gateway is establishing an outbound a connection on 443. And so all you have to do is one firewall rule that makes sure that you have outbound access to a well-known IP address, in this particular case, the trust broker, right? And because the gateway is sitting on the network, and quite often these industrial switches, especially in the case of Cisco, also do network address translation, right? And so you're sitting below the NAT boundary. You're sitting below the zone-based firewall that you might be implementing to isolate these cells. And because you're sitting below those boundaries, you have access to every single asset, any asset that's in that environment, right? So you have 100% reachability to any private IP in your environment. And that is, you know, the biggest benefit that you get out of this, because you no longer have any complexity of exposing IPs outside. And then last but not the least, it's not just that this network element from Cisco, be that an industrial switch or an industrial router, is giving you secure connectivity and secure, you know, remote access to your OT asset, but you can also use that networking asset to enforce zero trust segmentation, right? So you can prevent lateral movement by now, you know, interfacing with NAC systems and zero trust systems to actually enforce segmentation on that networking entity itself. So you're providing connectivity, you're providing remote access, and you're doing zero trust segmentation, all within the network without having to put any additional hardware in that environment.
Wow, thanks, Ruben. This is quite honestly, this has been one of them as an operator and as somebody grew up in the manufacturing and the OT space. I can't count. I don't think there's a number large enough, the number of times that this would help to me out there. And I'm excited for this and the way that we're addressing that. But I do, while we're on this topic, there's a question out there that was answered, but I'd like for us to, you know, to hit it again, because it really talks about your benefits. But a question was asked that, you know, ZTNA solutions are great, but they're expensive and almost no one can afford to implement them. And I heard you describing that architecture about, it's a little bit about the Prego syndrome, right? It's in there. So hit that a little bit on how we're helping alleviate some of that complexity, but also the overall cost, how we're making that tangible for users to get access to.
Yeah, so the complexity part I touched upon, Kevin, quite a bit, right? The complexity comes from the location of the gateway, right? Mm-hmm. If the gateway is far from the OT asset, then the complexity is largely, you know, attributed to the fact that how do you expose these IPs up to the gateway, right? And that becomes like the end users kind of like challenge. From a cost perspective, cost comes from two areas. The main cost comes from how do you get these gateways closest to the asset in question, right, or the assets in question, and that means that you have to deploy a lot of them. Think about large manufacturing floors as to like how many additional pieces of hardware that you got to deploy. Think about like solar farms, wind farms, roadway traffic intersections. Just think about the complexity and the cost of installing these things. And cost is not just the cost of hardware. It's like, how do you manage these gateways? How do you make sure that they're patched and they're secure? And then the bigger challenge is, how do you even know where these gateways are coming from? Like, where were they manufactured, right? What is the integrity of the supply chain? And that's kind of what largely leads to the cost. I think with the centralized broker, you're actually having, you're reducing costs there from a centralized broker standpoint, because you're eliminating the need to, pay someone to have to manage these rules, deal with like all of these jump boxes and all of that. So there are two things involved here. The centralized trust broker actually helps reducing costs, but the gateways actually end up increasing costs. And I think the ability to get that gateway functionality onto the network and treat it as an element of the network, helps greatly in reducing the overall cost.
Awesome.
Hey, Kevin, real quick, I'd like to just jump in and tag on to that. Is so, zero trust, when we talk about zero trust in the industry, right, it can be very nebulous, right? It's kind of a broad term for a lot of things, much like, if I said cloud to you, it would mean something to different people depending upon what they needed to use it for. And I think, keeping in mind that zero trust is a strategy, right, or a framework. And so with that, you need to determine, and a way to keep your costs down while also providing the value is determine where the prioritization needs to go that you're going to execute that strategy and framework against, much like what we've been talking here, right? So this would just be one part of an overall zero trust strategy. And some of the platforms that would be used within this type of deployment of a zero trust strategy could be reused in other elements or other areas that you're going to do down the road, right? But I would really ask you all to consider, when you're talking about the zero trust, is determine where you're going to focus against an overall strategy, and then measure how you're going to get there, where the greatest value is, mission criticality, and really build that out to know where you're moving to and from, so that you can prove that value back to the business so you can keep building upon it.
Yep, 100%. Well, great points, everyone. What I do want to do is kind of transition into a summary, and I have one more question I'll answer here at the end as well. But I think now let's trigger that third poll question. And the question is would you like a Cisco security expert to actually contact you to run a one-to-one demo of secure equipment access? And we'd be happy to do that. So if that's something that you would be interested in, please, answer yes there, and we'll be sure to get back in touch with you. Now, if we look at kind of summarization of what we talked about today, we're moving beyond that whole notion of that conventional remote access to a zero trust access method to gain access. We're stopping those security backdoors from the VPNs, from the cellular gateways. We're, as Ruben has said, we're taking complexity out of the IDMZ and the firewalls. We're enforcing zero trust at a different layer in OT and giving you kind of the least privileged access and enforcing scheduling, posturing, multi-factor authentication and more. This is all driving a better user experience. So a user experience that's designed for how OT works and how the interaction needs to occur. It's easier for IT. It's a lot safer for everyone across the board. It's not only safer for OT, the CISOs are going to be very thankful when they start looking at the overall posture of the network itself. So it's just huge benefits to gain across the board there. Now, before I dive into the last Q&A, I also want to trigger the make sure the final poll goes out, because this is super important to us to make sure that we are doing what we need to do, and that their data and their information is beneficial. So give us a rating. So on a scale of 1 to 5, how do you think that this information was? We'd love to get your feedback here to make sure that we're hitting the mark and adjust accordingly. Now, final question, and this kind of steps back and takes a broader look here, folks. So I'm gonna broaden the canvas just a bit. So when we think about this question that was answered, they started talking about visibility. And they asked the question about, visibility is so important, and visibility ties hand in hand in a phase with another one of our product tools to give you true floor visibility and security. So how can organizations get visibility, continuous monitoring, and what OT environments are doing? What other technologies can Cisco employ in this regard to help with visibility? I'll throw that up, and whoever wants to answer that can take it.
Yeah, let me take that, Kevin. So that's the key point, right? Which is it's not so much that you need to bring in new technology to secure operational environments. You can take all your existing technology that you have in the enterprise and bring it and apply it in the industrial space, as long as you have context of what is going on, right? And that context is derived from visibility. And so there are several ways to do that. And there are several products out there in the industry that provide that visibility and context. And there are two key things that are, two techniques that are used, right? One is active discovery, right? Which in the past has always been a big no-no in industrial environments. But I think, products and technologies have evolved to a point where we know how to do that in a safe, secure manner now, right? So there are multiple active discovery tools and techniques available. And the second one is deep packet inspection, right? And the deep packet inspection part is still as kind of a bit of a sticking point, is because to do deep packet inspection, you need to be able to inspect that traffic. And to inspect that traffic, you need to feed it to the entity that's doing the deep packet inspection. And many of the solutions out there are centralized solutions. Again, just like the centralized ZTNA gateway, centralized solutions where you got to span traffic up to these solutions, and that spanning becomes very, very expensive. Quite often, the cost of spanning or installing taps is much more expensive than the solution itself, right? And that's where most of the projects fail. And so there's another product in Cisco called Cisco CyberVision that does this. And the playbook is the same, right? Which is you embed the deep packet inspection and the active discovery into the network, so you don't have to deal with additional hardware and you don't have to span traffic. So that's one efficient way to do it.
Yeah, thanks, Ruben. So in keeping to our promise, it is 12:58. Please don't forget to give us a rating here on that last poll that just launched. I want to thank everybody on the panel. Great interaction, great feedback. I want to thank everyone for the questions. There were some great questions that were posed, and thank the team for really jumping on those and trying to answer them as well. Now I'm going to actually end the call here. Thanks to IoT World and the ICS Cybersecurity Day. I know there's other sessions coming up, so don't want to run long, but thanks everybody for joining, and I look forward to further engagements with everybody, and hopefully more questions to come.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.